Garrett Sullivan's gelding stumbled through snow that rose past its chest. The wind cut like a knife, and the February dusk turned everything to ash except for the trail of smoke rising in the distance. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed the exhausted horse forward. 3 hours he'd ridden through this hell, spurred on by a neighbor's frantic message delivered to his ranch that morning. "Your parents' home. Fire in the night. Come quick." The message had been sparse, saying nothing of survivors. Now, as he crested the final hill overlooking the small homestead where he'd grown up, his breath caught in his throat. Where the modest cabin should have stood, only blackened timbers remained. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Garrett's boots sank deep into the snow as he stumbled forward, scanning the blackened ruins for any sign of life or death, his voice cracking as he called out again and again, "Ma, Pa." But the howling wind swallowed his desperate cries, leaving only the skeletal frames of charred timbers reaching toward the gray sky like accusing fingers. The barn still stood untouched, but the house was gone, reduced to ashes and memories, with only the stone chimney remaining upright as a lone sentinel over the destruction. 3 months. It had been 3 whole months since he'd last visited, 2 consumed with land deals in Montana, cattle contracts that stretched across 3 territories, and the endless expansion of his empire to spare even a weekend for the 2 people who'd given him life. He'd sent letters, money, even hired hands to help with their chores, but not his presence, never his actual presence, and now the weight of that absence crushed down on him like the Wyoming winter itself. "Sullivan," a voice called from behind, and Garrett spun around, hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip, finding old Jennings standing there with a lantern raised against the gathering darkness, his weathered face grim beneath a snow-covered hat. "My parents," Garrett gasped, barely able to form the words. "Are they—" "Alive," Jennings interrupted, and relief flooded through Garrett's body so powerfully it nearly buckled his knees. "Fire took hold 3 nights back, middle of the night. Would have taken them too if not for the Widow Winters." Garrett repeated the name. Widow Winters, finding it vaguely familiar, somewhere in the recesses of his memory. "Sarah Winters, lives up on Ridge Creek," Jennings explained, gesturing toward the distant hills where a faint light glowed against the darkening sky. "Husband died a couple years past. Strange thing is, she wasn't just passing by like she claims. According to your ma, she'd been keeping an eye on your folks ever since. That city man came around fancy suit, banker type making threats about selling their land." Garrett's frown deepened as a cold dread settled in his gut. "What city man?" "Some fellow named Blackwood, works for a bank in town," Jennings said, his tone hardening. "Been pressuring smaller homesteaders to sell, offering pennies on the dollar, then getting nasty when they refuse. Your pa refused him, and Sarah overheard the argument from the ridge while gathering herbs. Said she didn't like his tone, the way he was threatening them. So she'd been checking on your parents every night since, making sure they were safe. She was approaching the house when she saw the flames. Got your folks out just before the roof collapsed. They've been with her since, sharing what little she has." The shame burned hotter than any fire could have, searing through Garrett's chest as he realized a stranger, a poor widow struggling through her own hardships, had been protecting his parents while he'd been hundreds of miles away counting his money and congratulating himself on his success. "Thank you," he managed to say, already turning back to his exhausted horse. "I'll head there now." But Jennings caught his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age, and when Garrett met his eyes, he saw none of the deference most men showed the wealthy Garrett Sullivan. "Sullivan," Jennings said, his voice hard as iron, "your folks needed you 3 days ago. They needed you 3 months ago, 3 years ago. That woman's been sharing what little she has, and believe me, it's precious little while you've been building your kingdom. Shame on you, boy. Shame on you." Garrett nodded once, unable to meet the old man's eyes, unable to defend himself because there was no defense, and mounted his horse with those words echoing in his ears louder than any accusation his father had ever leveled at him. As he turned toward the distant light on the ridge, snowflakes began to fall once more, erasing his tracks almost as soon as they were made, as if the land itself wanted to forget his passage. The small cabin on Ridge Creek glowed like a beacon against the storm, smoke curling from its chimney into the darkening sky, and Garrett approached slowly, his heart hammering with something beyond exhaustion, a mixture of dread and desperate hope that made his hands shake on the reins. He dismounted, tethered his horse beneath the crude lean-to beside the cabin, and moved to the window, compelled by some force he couldn't name to observe before announcing himself. Through the crystalline patterns of frost on the glass, he saw his mother seated at a rough-hewn table, her silver braid loose over one shoulder. And she was laughing, actually laughing, a sound he hadn't heard since before Elizabeth died, since before the world had turned gray and cold. A woman in a faded calico dress, patches visible on the sleeves, ladled stew into wooden bowls with practiced efficiency, and his father's bent shoulders hunched over his plate, but his gnarled hand reached out to rest on the woman's wrist as she passed. A gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. Sarah Winters, he could see her clearly now, perhaps 40 years old, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face lined by hardship but strong, dignified despite the poverty evident in every corner of her small home. She was feeding his parents, sharing her meager stores, keeping them warm and safe, doing everything a good son should have done, and the weight of his neglect hit him with crushing force. He'd built an empire, owned 3 sprawling ranches spanning 2 territories, had a bank account that could buy half of Cedar Valley if he wanted, employed over 100 men, and dealt with cattle barons and railroad executives as equals. But this stranger, this woman with flour on her apron and patches on her sleeves, was doing what he should have done, what he'd failed to do, what he'd been too proud and too busy to do. An empty rocking chair sat by the fire, as if waiting, as if holding space for something or someone absent, and Garrett's hand hovered over the door latch, his breath frosting in the air, his courage faltering for the first time since he'd charged Confederate lines at Shiloh. Inside, his mother's laughter rang out again, warm and bright and alive, and he thought perhaps he should wait, perhaps he should come back in the morning, perhaps he wasn't ready to face what waited beyond that door. But the door swung open before he could decide, and cold air flooded the cabin as Sarah Winters stood in the doorway, wooden spoon in hand, her gray eyes sharp as flint and twice as hard. "Mr. Sullivan," she said flatly. No warmth, no welcome, just a statement of fact. And behind her, his mother gasped. Garrett, rising from the table with joy and hurt warring on her face in equal measure. His father didn't stand, didn't even turn around, just kept his eyes fixed on his bowl, and the silence stretched between them like the years, like the distance, like all the unspoken words that had piled up like snowdrifts between father and son. "You're late, Sullivan," Daniel finally said, his voice rough as gravel worn smooth by a bitter stream. Still not turning, still not using his name, using the surname instead as he'd done since Garrett returned from the war. House burned down 3 days ago. In that moment, Garrett felt the dawn, old battlefield reopen between them. Not the literal battlefields of the war, but the older, deeper conflict that had defined their relationship since that spring day in 1862, when Garrett had announced his intention to enlist in the Union Army against his father's explicit wishes and dire warnings. He could still see the recruitment poster tacked to the general store wall, still feel the weight of his decision, still hear his father's voice thundering, "No son of mine fights for Lincoln's army." The fist slamming on the table so hard the plates jumped, that same table now reduced to ashes in the ruins down the valley. Daniel hadn't come to see him off at the station, hadn't read the letters Garrett sent from training camp, hadn't acknowledged his existence for 2 full years after Shiloh. And when news came of Elizabeth's difficult pregnancy, Daniel had written just once, not to his son but to Elizabeth herself. "Come home to people who care for you properly. Your husband has made his choice." For 2 years after Garrett's return from the war, his father had refused to call him by his first name, addressing him only as Sullivan, as if speaking to a stranger, to a hired hand, to anyone but his own flesh and blood, and the wall between them had never fully come down, just weathered enough over the decades to let necessary words pass through like wind through cracks in old timber. "Ma," Garrett said, stepping inside and pulling off his hat, snow melting on the floorboards and pooling around his boots. "Pa," he added, forcing the word out even though his father still hadn't turned to look at him. Sarah closed the door behind him with more force than necessary and set another bowl on the table without a word, her movements tight and controlled, radiating disapproval in every gesture. And she didn't look at him. didn't acknowledge him beyond that initial cold greeting, treating him with the same warmth she might show a tax collector or a snake that had slithered across her threshold. "Sit," his mother said softly, gesturing to the empty chair. And Clara Sullivan, who had always been the bridge between her husband and son, the mediator spanning the chasm that separated them, moved to embrace Garrett even as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks, her thin arms surprisingly strong as they wrapped around him, holding him as she hadn't been able to do for 3 months, for 3 years. For all the time he'd spent building his empire instead of maintaining his family, Garrett spent that first night in Sarah's barn, refusing her reluctant offer of the floor by the fire, insisting that he'd imposed enough already and that the hayloft would suit him fine, though in truth, the cold bit through his coat, and the shame burned hotter than any hearth could warm. He lay awake in the darkness, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the weathered boards, thinking about the woman who had given up her own comfort to shelter strangers while he'd been sleeping in feather beds in his grand ranch house 300 miles away. And when dawn broke gray and cold across the valley, he rose with a determination that had nothing to do with business deals or cattle contracts, and everything to do with becoming the man he should have been all along. After a breakfast of thin porridge that Sarah served with the same cool efficiency she'd shown the night before, Garrett announced his intention to ride back to the ruins and investigate the fire more thoroughly, and, despite Sarah's skeptical look and his father's grunt of what might have been approval or dismissal, he saddled his horse and made the journey through fresh snow that had fallen during the night. What he found in the cold light of morning sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. The burn patterns were wrong, starting in 3 separate locations, rather than spreading from a single source. And when he cleared away the snow and ash near the base of what had been the bedroom wall, he found the unmistakable residue of kerosene and the charred remains of rags that had been soaked and placed deliberately. This was no accident, no errant spark from the fireplace or knocked-over lantern, but arson, cold and calculated, and Garrett's hands shook with rage as he gathered the evidence, wrapping the remnants carefully in oilcloth from his saddlebag. He rode directly to town, to the sheriff's office where Tom Patterson sat with his feet up on his desk, and laid out what he'd found. But Patterson's reaction told Garrett everything he needed to know about how deep this corruption ran. The sheriff barely glanced at the evidence, muttered something about accidents being common in winter, and suggested that Garrett not go stirring up trouble for respectable businessmen without proof beyond some burned rags. "Blackwood," Garrett said flatly, not a question but an accusation, and Patterson's face confirmed it even as the sheriff protested that Hiram Blackwood was a legitimate banker doing legitimate business, that half the town owed him money, that making wild accusations could be dangerous for a man's health, even a man as wealthy as Garrett Sullivan. Over the following days, Garrett began his own investigation, talking to homesteaders in quiet corners of the general store, learning that Blackwood had been systematically targeting small landholders whose properties bordered the proposed route of the new railroad spur, offering insulting prices, and then turning to intimidation when his offers were refused, burned crops, poisoned wells, mysterious accidents that the sheriff never seemed able to solve. Mrs. Chen, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, told Garrett in hushed Mandarin that her warehouse had caught fire 2 months after she refused to sell, and only her son's quick action had saved the building. But Patterson had called it an accident despite the kerosene smell that lingered for weeks. Meanwhile, Sarah watched Garrett's comings and goings with barely concealed suspicion, and when he returned each evening to her cabin where his parents still sheltered, she made her distrust clear in the set of her shoulders and the coolness of her words. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Sullivan," she said one evening when he tried to pay her for his parents' keep, her gray eyes flashing with pride and something deeper, something wounded. "And I don't need you riding in here like some knight in expensive boots, thinking your money can fix everything it couldn't prevent." Her words stung because they were true, because he had been exactly that kind of man, the kind who threw money at problems instead of showing up, who built empires instead of tending relationships. And Garrett found himself without a response except to quietly pocket his unwanted payment and ask instead, "What needs doing around here?" The question seemed to surprise her, and for a moment her guard dropped enough for him to see the exhaustion beneath her pride, the bone-deep weariness of a woman who'd been surviving alone for 2 years on nothing but determination and spite. "The fence on the north pasture is down," she finally said, "and the chicken coop needs a new roof before the next storm. and the well pump is freezing every night. But I don't expect. I'll start with the fence, Garrett interrupted, already heading for the barn to find tools. And he spent the next day in the bitter cold, digging post holes in frozen ground until his hands bled inside his gloves and his back screamed with the kind of honest pain he hadn't felt since before he'd made his fortune. His father appeared mid-morning, saying nothing, just picking up a hammer and working alongside him in silence. And Garrett felt something shift in that quietness, some ice beginning to thaw in the spaces between them. They worked together for 3 days straight, repairing Sarah's property. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Daniel began to soften, began to offer instruction rather than criticism, began to call him son once in a while instead of Sullivan, and Clara watched from the cabin window with tears of gratitude streaming down her face because she'd prayed for 15 years to see this healing begin. In the evenings, after supper, while Clara knitted by the fire and Daniel dozed in the rocking chair, Garrett and Sarah found themselves talking in low voices at the kitchen table, sharing the stories they'd both been carrying alone for too long. She told him about Thomas, her husband, killed when his horse threw him during a spring storm, leaving her with debts and a failing farm and a well of grief so deep she thought she'd drown in it. He told her about Elizabeth, about the difficult birth that had taken both her and their daughter, about the way he'd thrown himself into work afterward because work didn't require him to feel, didn't demand that he face the emptiness in his heart. I became successful because I was running, he admitted one night, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face, building bigger and bigger so I wouldn't have to look at what I'd lost, so I wouldn't have to be present for anything real. Sarah studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, just enough. At least you're finally stopping long enough to look, she said quietly, and it wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding, and Garrett found that meant more than he'd expected. The mutual respect that grew between them was tentative and hard-won, built on shared labor and honest conversation, on seeing each other clearly without pretense or performance, and Garrett caught himself watching her more often than was strictly appropriate, noticing the strength in her hands as she kneaded bread, the determination in her eyes when she talked about keeping her land, the rare smile that transformed her whole face when Clara made her laugh. But just as something fragile and precious was beginning to bloom between them, the danger that had been circling finally struck. Garrett's investigation had uncovered enough evidence to prove that Blackwood had orchestrated not just intimidation but outright arson across the valley, that he'd bribed Patterson to look the other way, and that his scheme involved stealing land to sell to the railroad at inflated prices, making himself rich while destroying the lives of families who'd built their homes with their own hands. When Garrett confronted Blackwood in his fancy office above the bank, the man's mask of respectability slipped to reveal something cold and vicious underneath, and Blackwood's threat was delivered with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been held accountable for anything. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sullivan," Blackwood said, leaning back in his leather chair. "And you've made yourself vulnerable by caring about that little widow and your pathetic parents. Accidents happen all the time in winter, especially to people who don't know when to mind their own business." Garrett left that meeting with his blood running cold, and he returned to Sarah's cabin to find his worst fears, realized 2 of Blackwood's hired thugs were there, one holding Sarah by the arm while she struggled, the other standing over Daniel who'd been knocked to the ground trying to protect her, and Clara was screaming from the doorway. Garrett moved without thinking, years of survival instinct from the war taking over, and within moments both men were disarmed and on the ground, one with a broken nose and the other with Garrett's pistol pressed against his temple, and the rage that burned through Garrett was nothing like the cold ambition that had driven him for years, but something fierce and protective and absolutely uncompromising. "You tell Blackwood," Garrett said, his voice deadly quiet, "that if he comes near my family again, if he so much as looks at them wrong, I will use every dollar, every connection, every resource I have to destroy him completely, and then I'll do the rest with my bare hands." The men fled, bloodied and terrified, and as Garrett helped his father to his feet and checked Sarah for injuries, finding only bruises on her arm where the thug had grabbed her, he saw the look in her eyes change from fear to something else, something that recognized him, not as the absent son or the wealthy rancher, but as someone who would stand and fight for what mattered, someone who had Finally learned that the only empire worth building was the one that protected the people you loved. The attack on Sarah's cabin proved to be Blackwood's fatal mistake, because it galvanized the entire valley in a way that quiet intimidation never could. And within 2 days, Garrett had organized a meeting at the church where nearly every homesteader in Cedar Valley gathered, their faces grim with shared anger and the determination of people who'd been pushed too far for too long. Mrs. Chen stood up first, her accented English clear and strong as she detailed the fire that had nearly destroyed her warehouse. And then old Jennings spoke about the poisoned well that had killed half his cattle. And one by one, families came forward with their stories of threats and violence and a sheriff who'd looked the other way because Blackwood's money spoke louder than justice. Garrett had spent those 2 days doing what he did best, using his wealth and connections not to build his own empire but to dismantle Blackwood's, and he'd sent telegrams to the territorial governor, to railroad executives, who had no idea their route surveys were being used for extortion, to newspaper editors in Cheyenne and Denver who were always hungry for stories of corruption, and most importantly, to a U.S. Marshal named Cordell who owed Garrett a favor from years back and who arrived in Cedar Valley with a federal warrant and an attitude that suggested Sheriff Patterson's days of looking the other way were over. The confrontation came on a bitter February morning when Marshal Cordell, backed by Garrett and a dozen armed homesteaders who'd finally found their courage in numbers, walked into Blackwood's office above the bank and laid out the evidence that Garrett had meticulously gathered testimonies from victims, financial records that Mrs. Chen's husband had copied during a late-night visit to the bank, statements from 2 of Blackwood's own hired men who'd decided that prison time for conspiracy was better than hanging for murder if things went any further. Blackwood tried his usual intimidation tactics, threats about powerful friends and expensive lawyers, but his voice held a tremor that betrayed his fear. And when Cordell calmly informed him that the territorial governor himself had signed the warrant and that the railroad executives were considering fraud charges of their own, Blackwood's carefully constructed facade crumbled like the burned timbers of Daniel Sullivan's home. "You can't do this," Blackwood snarled, his face flushing red with impotent rage as Cordell fastened the irons around his wrists. "I'm a respected businessman. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent," Cordell interrupted, "which I'd strongly suggest you exercise, because every word out of your mouth right now is just giving me more reasons to make sure you see the inside of a territorial prison for a very long time." As they led Blackwood down the stairs past the growing crowd of townspeople who'd gathered to watch, past the families he'd terrorized and the properties he'd tried to steal, Garrett felt not triumph but a profound sense of relief, as if a poison had been drawn from a wound that had been festering for months. Sheriff Patterson was removed from office that same day, escorted out of town by the marshal with instructions that if he ever returned to Wyoming territory, he'd be arrested for corruption and conspiracy, and the town council appointed Jennings as temporary sheriff until proper elections could be held in the spring. But the moment that meant more to Garrett than any of the legal victories came that evening, when he returned to Sarah's cabin exhausted and covered in trail dust, and his father met him at the door, pulled him into an embrace that smelled of wood smoke and honest sweat, and said clearly, loudly, for everyone to hear, "I'm proud of you, son. Your mother and we're both proud of the man you've become." Daniel's voice cracked on the word son, and Garrett felt 15 years of coldness melt away in that single moment, felt the old battlefield finally close, felt forgiveness flow both ways across the chasm that had separated them since that spring day in 1862, when a young man had chosen principle over paternal approval. Clara wept openly, her hands pressed to her mouth, and even Sarah's eyes glistened with tears as she witnessed the healing of a wound she'd helped to mend simply by giving them all a space to be present together, to work side by side, to remember what family actually meant beyond the grudges and the grievances and the years of silence. The days that followed were filled with planning and building in every sense. Garrett purchased lumber from the mill in town and hired a crew to begin construction on a new home for his parents. A comfortable dwelling with wide porches and ample windows that Daniel had a hand in designing, insisting on doing much of the finish work himself, his hands steady again as he carved decorative elements into door frames and window casings with a craftsman's pride that Garrett hadn't seen in years. The house would sit on a rise near Sarah's cabin, close enough for daily visits but separate enough for privacy, a perfect balance between independence and family connection. But Garrett's ambitions for the valley extended beyond just rebuilding what had been destroyed. And at another community meeting, he proposed something that had been forming in his mind since the night Sarah had served him stew in her humble kitchen, a cooperative of small homesteaders who would pool resources, share equipment, negotiate collectively with buyers, and most importantly, protect each other from the kind of predatory schemes that Blackwood had perpetrated. "I'll provide the initial capital," Garrett explained to the assembled families, "not as charity but as an investment. And every family will have an equal vote regardless of the size of their holdings. Because what happened to my parents, what happened to all of you, it can't happen again." The response was overwhelming, with families signing up immediately, and Mrs. Chen volunteered to keep the books since numbers were her specialty, and Jennings agreed to serve as mediator for disputes, and suddenly the valley that had been fractured by fear and intimidation was knitting itself back together into something stronger than it had been before. Through all of this, Garrett was aware of Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between admiration and wariness. And when he tried to include her in the planning, tried to ensure she'd be protected and provided for, she bristled with the fierce independence that he'd come to respect even as it frustrated him. "I don't need protecting, Garrett Sullivan," she said one evening when they were alone, Clara and Daniel having retired early. "And I don't need you swooping in to save me like I'm some damsel in a dime novel. I survived 2 years on my own before you showed up, and I'll survive long after you ride. Back to your ranches and your empire and your real life." Her words struck him like a physical blow because they revealed the fear beneath her strength, the belief that his presence was temporary, that his transformation was an illusion that would fade once the crisis passed, that he was ultimately no different from Thomas who'd made promises and then left her alone through death's cruel randomness. "This is my real life," Garrett said quietly, stepping closer but not touching her, respecting the space she needed even as he ached to bridge it. "Here, with my parents, with this community, with you. Everything else, all those ranches and deals and contracts, that was me running from my real life. Building walls made of cattle and land and money, so I wouldn't have to feel anything real or risk losing anything that mattered. You think I'm going to leave. But Sarah, I finally stopped running. This is where I'm staying." She searched his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, for the crack in his conviction, and he let her look. Let her see everything, the grief he still carried for Elizabeth, the shame of his neglect, the determination to become worthy of the second chance he'd been given, and beneath it all, the growing love that terrified him because it made him vulnerable again but that he refused to run from this time. "I'm scared," Sarah finally whispered, and the admission cost her dearly. This woman who faced down hired thugs and Wyoming winters with equal fearlessness. "I'm scared to trust this, to trust you, to risk my heart again when I barely survived losing Thomas." "I know," Garrett said, and he took her hands in his calloused palms against calloused palms, the hands of people who'd both learned that comfort wasn't freely given but built through labor and sacrifice. "I'm scared too, but I'd rather be scared together than safe and alone. And Sarah, you deserve more than survival. You deserve joy and partnership and a life that isn't just about getting through the next winter." The spring came early that year, as if the land itself sensed the need for renewal, and on a morning when the snow was melting to reveal green shoots beneath, Garrett asked Sarah to ride with him, and they traveled together to the small cemetery on the hill where Thomas Winters lay beneath a simple stone and where, in a plot that Garrett had purchased years ago but never visited, Elizabeth Sullivan and their infant daughter rested side by side. They stood there in silence for a long time, Garrett's hand finding Sarah's. And he talked to Elizabeth for the first time since her funeral, told her about the man he'd become in his grief and the man he was trying to become now, asked her forgiveness for using her memory as an excuse to stop living, thanked her for the years they'd had even though they'd been cut so brutally short. Sarah spoke to Thomas too, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, telling him she'd always love him but that she was ready to love again, that she hoped he'd understand, that she knew he'd want her to be happy rather than spending the rest of her life as a monument to his memory. "They'd want us to live," Sarah said finally, turning to face Garrett, the morning sun catching the gray in her hair and making it shine like silver. "Not just survive, but actually live, fully and completely, without apology." "Then live with me," Garrett said, the words he'd been practicing all morning suddenly inadequate to express what he felt. Not because you need me or I need you. Not out of convenience or charity or some sense of obligation, but because together we're better than we are apart. Because we've both been given a second chance and I don't want to waste a single day of it. Because I love you, Sarah Winters, and I want to build a life with you that honors both what we've lost and what we've found. Her answer came not in words but in a kiss, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper. A promise exchanged, in the language beyond speech, and when they finally pulled apart, both breathless and slightly stunned, she smiled, genuinely smiled, and said simply, yes. Their wedding took place on a perfect June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the meadow between the cabins and the entire population of Cedar Valley spreading picnic blankets across the grass, bringing dishes and gifts and genuine good wishes for the couple who'd somehow become symbols of the valley's own transformation from fear to hope. Pastor Morrison performed the ceremony beneath an arch of twisted willow branches that Daniel had crafted with his own hands, his voice carrying across the valley as he spoke of second chances and the courage to begin anew. And Sarah wore a simple dress of ivory linen with sprigs of lavender tucked into her hair that Clara had gathered that morning. Garrett couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Daniel's arm, his father steady and proud, escorting the woman who had saved his life twice, once from the fire and once from the slow death of pride and isolation. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly from the front row, her shrewd eyes taking in the transformation of both the land and its people, and news had reached them the previous day that Hiram Blackwood had been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison. Justice served, though Garrett found the news brought him more relief than satisfaction because the man's actions had, in their twisted way, led him back to this place, to these people, to himself. By August, Daniel and Clara's new house stood complete, positioned to catch both sunrise and sunset, as if claiming all hours of the day for living fully. And Daniel had insisted on doing the finish work himself, his hands steady as they carved beauty into wood, creating a home rather than just a shelter. Lawrence, the town doctor, had expanded his practice to include a small hospital wing with Sarah, serving as head nurse 3 days a week, her reputation growing beyond Cedar Valley as people traveled from neighboring settlements to benefit from her knowledge of both traditional medicine and frontier remedies. And on her off days she tended her expanded garden, preserving herbs and teaching Clara the medicinal properties of each plant, passing knowledge forward as it had been passed to her. As autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, Sarah and Garrett sat on their porch in the gathering dusk, watching Daniel demonstrate wood-carving techniques to a small group of children from town, including young Wei Chen, who showed remarkable aptitude under Daniel's patient instruction, and Sarah's hand rested on the gentle swell of her abdomen, the miracle growing there still almost too precious to believe. He's found his purpose, Sarah observed, her voice soft with contentment, teaching the next generation, passing forward what he knows. Garrett covered her hand with his, still marveling at how life could surprise you, how grace could arrive in the midst of grief, how home wasn't a place you returned to but something you created new each day through choice and presence and love. Clara emerged from the cabin carrying a tray with cups of hot cider, pausing to straighten a third rocking chair that sat between the two larger ones. A small chair perfectly scaled for a child that Daniel had completed the previous week, his eyes twinkling as he presented it with the words, "For the newest Sullivan, when they're ready." As darkness settled over the valley, the family gathered around the fire pit Daniel had built between the two houses, stories flowing as freely as the laughter, plans made for spring planting and summer harvests. And in the dance of the flames, Garrett could almost see the faces of those who'd brought them to this moment, Elizabeth and Thomas, not as ghosts to be feared, but as gentle guardians blessing the life that continued, approving the love that had bloomed in soil fertilized by their memory. Home was no longer something to flee from or return to with dread and duty, but something they created anew with every choice, every act of forgiveness, every moment of genuine presence. And as Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her breath steady and peaceful, Garrett understood that the empire he'd built across 3 territories was nothing compared to this, a family forged not by blood alone but by choice and sacrifice and love that bloomed in the hardest soil, roots growing deep enough to withstand any winter, strong enough to support generations yet to come. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, completely, irrevocably home.